Hi, my name is Jeffrey Smith with the Institute for Responsible Technology. And I've been asked to comment on the health dangers of GMOs and also about the Canadian-EU trade agreement that might expose Europeans to those dangers. Now, first of all, I feel like I'm in a movie and I want to say, don't go in there, it's a trap. When you make an agreement with Canada, from the experience we've seen, Canada marches lockstep with the United States. So doing an agreement on GMOs or GMO-related agreement with Canada, you are as if working with the United States. And the United States equals Monsanto. Working with the United States is as if doing an agreement with Monsanto. So if you are making an agreement with Canada, just understand that you're signing an agreement to support Monsanto's interests. In fact, according to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the regulatory cooperation provisions in CETA, quote, create new channels for industry to apply pressure to weaken EU food safety standards. We'll go into that in a minute, but first let's talk about the relevance of GMOs and is it a problem in the first place. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration created a policy in 1992 claiming that the agency wasn't aware of any information showing that GMOs were significantly different. On that basis, they said no testing was necessary and not a single safety study was necessary. So companies like Monsanto, the largest GMO maker, who told us that Agent Orange, PCBs, and DDT were safe and got that one wrong, could determine on their own if their own GMOs were safe and put them on the market without even telling the U.S. Food and Drug Administration or the American people. It turns out that that policy, that statement in the policy, was a lie. Not only was the agency aware that GMOs were different and dangerous, it was the overwhelming consensus among their own scientists that GMOs could create allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems, and needed to be studied in an in-depth fashion before the products were released to the environment and exposed to the public. But the White House had instructed the FDA to promote biotechnology, and so they brought in Monsanto's former attorney, Michael Taylor, to be in charge of GMO policy, and he's the one that ignored the scientists' warnings. He then became Monsanto's vice president and then returned to the FDA and the Obama administration as the U.S. food czar. So when I talk about that the United States is equal to Monsanto, it's not just an abstract concept, and we can go further into that, but let's not. Let's go deeper into the warnings by the FDA scientists, and did they turn out to be true? Well, in 2009, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine reviewed the animal feeding studies on GMOs and determined that there was so much damage to these animals fed GMOs in these carefully controlled studies, including gastrointestinal, immune, and reproductive system damage, organ damage, accelerated aging, dysfunctional regulation of cholesterol and insulin. They said that they should be withdrawn immediately and all doctors in the meantime should prescribe non-GMO diets to everyone. It turns out thousands of U.S. doctors are doing just that, prescribing non-GMO diets. And millions, in fact, are seeking non-GMO foods as 57% of Americans are concerned that GMOs are unsafe. We have had the good pleasure of interviewing and hearing testimonies from thousands and thousands of people and physicians. And it turns out that when people stop eating GMOs, they get better from the same type of diseases and disorders that afflict the lab animals in the carefully controlled studies. When pets and livestock are taken off of GMOs, according to farmers, veterinarians, and pet owners, they too get better from these same categories of diseases, which are also on the rise in the U.S. population, rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs, as well as the increased use of Roundup or glyphosate-based herbicides sprayed on this GMO acreage. Now, I want to make clear, in case you're not aware, that most GMOs are engineered crops designed to be sprayed with chemical herbicides. Roundup is the most popular herbicide in the world, just declared a Class 2A carcinogen by the World Health Organization 2 years ago, and it can be sprayed on Roundup-ready crops by Monsanto: soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa. And 80% of the GMOs out there are engineered to withstand Roundup or other herbicides. and the balance is almost entirely devoted to the corn and cotton plants engineered to produce their own toxic insecticide, which breaks open the little holes in the walls of the guts of insects to kill them. Now, if you look at the characteristics of GMOs, and we'll look at 3 right now. First, the very process of making a genetic engineering creates unpredicted side effects. Second, that Bt toxin might affect human health. And third, the glyphosate or Roundup residues in the food might affect human health. If you look at those characteristics alone, they might explain and even predict these type of disorders occurring in individuals and the recovery from these disorders when individuals switch to non-GMO foods. First, the process of genetic engineering. This is what the scientists at the FDA talked about, that you create allergens and toxins, etc. It turns out that the process is not this simple insertion of a new gene, and that's all there is. There's massive collateral damage that occurs in the DNA. 2 to 4% of the DNA is different due to the insertion process and the cloning, which happens after the cells are inserted with the new gene. In fact, up to 5% of the naturally functioning genes in an organism can change their levels of expression as a result of inserting a single new gene. And this was made clear earlier this year when a study was published on Monsanto's Roundup Ready corn. Actually, it was late last year. And it turns out that it produces over 200 different proteins or metabolites in different arrangements, different levels than the natural parent corn. And 2 of those compounds, called putrescine and cadaverine, are not only responsible for the foul odor of rotting dead bodies and are in larger concentrations in the Roundup Ready corn, but more importantly, they're linked to allergic reactions and cancer. Another corn variety from Monsanto, Monet 10 in fact, which is their most popular, that has a completely new allergen that's not found in natural corn, and their soy has as much as 7-fold increase in a known soy allergen. These are just some of the background noise, the side effects that are unpredictable but are the most common effects of the process of genetic engineering. Next, we have Bt toxin. Bt toxin is derived from soil bacteria that can be sprayed on crops naturally, and it kills insects, certain types, by breaking open little holes in the walls of those insects' stomachs and kills them. Now, there's been an assumption by the Canadian Health Canada and the FDA and the biotech industry that Bt toxin in its natural state is safe, and therefore we don't even have to test for the impacts of the Bt toxin produced in the corn. Well, it turns out there's peer-reviewed published studies that show even the natural Bt toxin can create allergic reactions in animals and humans and damage the walls of the intestines of mice. And studies done on genetically modified Bt corn show serious issues, both Monsanto studies and other studies done in Europe. Now, the Bt toxin turns out not to just poke holes in the cells of insects, but according to a 2012 study in the Journal of Applied Toxicology, it can poke holes in human cells in test tube situations under high concentrations. So we're now eating Bt toxin, which is known to have biological effects on human cells and might poke holes in human cells, possibly creating leaky gut. The walls of the intestines are only 1 cell thick if there's holes in it, which is how it kills insects. And it's the same type of holes that it bores in human cells as well as insects, according to the study. It might allow leaky gut or permeable gut, which is linked to cancer, heart disease, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, as well as autoimmune disease, inflammation, and allergies, among others. So the Bt toxin itself could predict the increased prevalence of some of these type of diseases. In addition, the Roundup residues present probably the most scientifically validated evidence of harm because there's more research done on Roundup and glyphosate than on Bt toxin or GMOs. Glyphosate was originally patented as a chelator. It binds with minerals, and it was used to clean boilers and pipes in factories because it pulled the minerals off the walls of these pipes and boilers. It was also patented as an herbicide by Monsanto and then later as an antibiotic. Now, I won't go into the great details of all the things and all the scientific studies done on glyphosate. I mentioned that it is a Class 2A carcinogen according to the World Health Organization. And we've found in recent papers made available because of a lawsuit that there was collusion between Monsanto and someone in the EPA who was working on behalf of Monsanto to try and get the EPA to pass glyphosate with flying colors, which happened. And another document from another former EPA scientist basically almost yelling at this person saying, it does cause cancer, there's all these evidence, please don't say that it doesn't, and work on behalf of your clients in the biotech industry and basically make your decisions on a political basis, which appears to be what's happened. So I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just talk about the nature of the glyphosate. Probable human carcinogen, antibiotic. It kills the beneficial bacteria in the gut easily. It doesn't kill the nasty stuff like E. coli, salmonella, and botulism. So it might create what's called dysbiosis, an imbalance of the gut bacteria, an overgrowth of the pathogens, which are linked to a long list of diseases. And it can cause a gap between the cell walls of the intestines, again, another form of leaky gut or permeable gut, and that list of diseases. It suppresses digestive enzymes. It can damage the walls of the intestines, therefore suppressing digestion as well. It's an endocrine disruptor at various concentrations. It's been known to be a teratogen, which means it leads to birth defects in studies that go back 30 years. And it also chelates minerals, making them unavailable, and certain trace minerals are absolutely necessary for certain metabolic pathways to occur. So Monsanto bragged for years that it blocks the shikimate pathway in plants. Humans don't have the shikimate pathway, therefore it's safe. It turns out the gut bacteria in our intestines use the shikimate pathway to produce the building blocks of neurotransmitters like serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine. And so if they're in lower concentrations, that's a whole list of diseases and disorders. So we have a situation where we're taking higher amounts of Roundup, glyphosate, into our bodies, Bt toxin. In fact, the Bt toxin was found in the blood of 93% of the pregnant women tested in Canada and 80% of their unborn fetuses. It's also known to be toxic to red blood cells, therefore being circulated in the blood of people that eat the Bt toxin could prove problematic for the health of the blood. We could go on for a long time, and there's publications that do go on listing all the different disorders and diseases. And we can see that it could be the Roundup, it could be the Bt toxin, it could be the process of genetic engineering which causes these problems. A 2-year study done in France looked at Monsanto's Roundup Ready corn and found that it created multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage in the rats compared to the controls. But they also fed another group the Roundup Ready corn that had never been sprayed with Roundup. And it too caused multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So you would think it's the corn and not the Roundup. But they fed another group low concentrations of Roundup and found that it also created multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So individually and together, the corn and the Roundup were linked to these different disorders. And follow-up studies on these rats found with absolute definitiveness that tiny amounts of Roundup, which are way below that allowed by the EU on a per day basis, on a per body weight basis, caused non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which can lead to all sorts of other liver diseases and complications. So now you've got just a glimpse of the experiences, of the research, the doctor's reports, and the epidemiological correlations, which are not causations on their own, they're correlations, but backed up by all these repeating patterns showing problems in various organ systems and bodily functions. Now let's go to Canada. Canada is completely locked into the United States. In fact, when they were approached to approve Monsanto's genetically engineered bovine growth hormone, which is banned in the EU, the head of the Health Canada section of the government was ready to approve it simply because it was approved by the United States. Fortunately, there were some very strong advocates for health, including Dr. Shiv Chopra, who worked at Health Canada, who challenged his boss and said, you can do that because you have the right, but I will make it known throughout Canada that we did no research and we did no even evaluation of the U.S. evaluation process of Monsanto's drug. So they allowed him to do it. He found all sorts of problems and all sorts of evidence that was ignored, so Canada could not approve it. but they never banned it. In order to protect their trade relationship with the United States, they didn't ban milk from products that have been from cows that have been injected with this bovine growth hormone. They just allowed it to be fed to their own people. They just couldn't sell the drug in Canada. I talked to a former Monsanto scientist, and he told me that 3 of his colleagues did the safety studies on the milk from treated cows at the company and found so much cancer-promoting hormone in the milk, the 3 Monsanto scientists refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic. One bought his own cow. He also confessed to me that another of his colleagues did studies on corn fed to rats, and the rats had so much damage that they had to rewrite the study to hide the effects rather than withdraw the corn. So when I say you're dealing with Canada that marches lockstep with the United States that is equivalent to Monsanto, this is what we have to be careful about. The United States and Canada sued the EU twice over food issues like growth hormones in beef and market access to GMOs. And the EU defended itself using the precautionary principle, which is not recognized in North America the way it is in Europe, and EU lost the battle. So now with CETA, you not only can be sued by governments, but you can be sued by companies, which means that the U.S. subsidiary of, like a Canadian subsidiary of a U.S. organization like Monsanto, if they have a subsidiary in Canada, they can sue the EU and demand more market access for their products. Canada is also trying to develop an allowable tolerance for contamination of unapproved varieties. They just approved salmon, genetically modified salmon, and an apple with a technology that could be far more dangerous than anything we've discussed. And even the scientists at the Environmental Protection Agency and the United States Department of Agriculture in the United States say that the regulatory framework to evaluate this, called double-stranded RNA, is completely inadequate to protect the health of individuals or the environment. Now, I haven't talked about the environment, so I'll end there. If you grow GMOs and they're dangerous, you can stop growing GMOs, but you can't remove the contamination from the gene pool. That goes on for as long as the gene pool goes on because of cross-pollination, because of seed movement. So there have been unapproved varieties found that resulted in $1 billion of damages in the United States. Starlink, I used to work at a GMO detection laboratory that first discovered an unapproved variety, Starlink, in the human food supply that resulted in $1 billion problem. It's still in the food supply. There's no way to eliminate all the genes from the Starlink corn, even though it was planted to less than 1% of the acreage in the United States. It will be there for as long as the corn genome is around, unless some future scientific science fiction thing turns reality and they can eliminate certain genes from the gene pool. So what we're talking about is irreversible changes in the gene pool as a result of planting GMOs or allowing live GMO insects and other organisms out into the environment. Now, I'm not against the possibility that someday we may be able to safely and predictably manipulate the genome for the benefit of health and the environment. But scientists that I've spoken to around the world, and I've traveled to 45 countries, and I've worked with scientists, and I've testified, and spoke to medical organizations regularly, they're of an agreement that the technology was released into food and into the environment long before the science was ready. Patents were going to expire. Returns on investment needed to happen. And so I was told originally about GMOs in 1996 by an award-winning genetic engineer who said in 1996 he was intimately aware of the technology and how it could lead to unpredicted side effects, and that aspect of the technology had not been solved. And so by releasing GMOs into the environment and putting them in the food supply, you can affect everyone who eats and then the entire ecosystem for all future generations. Now the biotech industry is pretending that the new GMO 2.0 are not really GMOs at all. But the scientists that I talk to say actually most of the risk associated with the current generation of GMOs are also found in this new CRISPR-Cas9 and all these different new gene editing techniques. And they're pretending that these problems are not there. They're pretending that they're not really GMOs. And that's one of the areas where we're quite confident Canada is going to put pressure on the EU to try and approve the next generation as non-GMOs and not even regulated. So we're talking about influencing potentially everyone who eats, all living beings and all future generations. This is the time to invoke the precautionary principle because the footprint of risk is unprecedented. And Canada and the US don't recognize the precautionary principle. And the tribunals that will overhear the investor-state dispute settlements, or the ICS version of it in the CETA, they may not recognize the precautionary principle as well. And once they're released, it's too late. So I want to end my statement by saying find an excuse. Find an excuse to say no to this agreement as long as GMOs are there threatening the health and environment of Europe. Safe eating.